a primary school teacher, a kidnapper, and a notorious criminal who receives a distress call not meant for him. Tonight, a wrong number will change everything, or bury it all. If you enjoy stories where fate is decided in seconds, hit like and comment the name of the city you're watching. I want to know how far this story has come. Don't turn off the screen. Start now. The rain came sideways that Tuesday night, the kind that found every gap in a collar and every crack in a window seal. Blackwater Ridge didn't get weather like other cities. It got punished. The streets turned black and reflective under the storm, and the few people still out moved fast with their heads down, not making eye contact with anything, not even the sky. Delaney Vale was still inside Ashcroft Elementary at 9:14 in the evening because she was the kind of person who stayed late. Not because she was dedicated in some noble storybook way. She stayed late because leaving meant going home to an apartment that was too quiet and too full of shadows she hadn't learned to ignore yet. The classroom was better. Paper stars cut from gold and silver foil hung from the drop ceiling on lengths of fishing line, catching the fluorescent light and throwing small, bright shapes across the rows of empty desks. She'd been cutting and hanging them for 2 hours. Tomorrow was the science fair, and she'd promised her third graders that the room would look like the inside of a planetarium by morning. Her scissors were cheap, and her fingers had blisters from the metal handles. She noticed the blood before she noticed the pain, a thin red crease on the inside of her right index finger where the blade had caught her on the 43rd star. She held it under her mouth for a second, tasted iron, then wrapped a strip of tape around it and kept going. 44. 45. The wind threw rain against the windows in long, rattling sheets, and every time a car turned into the parking lot with its headlights sweeping across the ceiling, her hands went still. That was the thing about hiding from someone for 2 years. Your hands learned to go still before your mind told them to. She didn't think about Gideon Cross on purpose. She had trained herself not to. But her hands thought about him constantly. They went still at headlights. They tensed at footsteps in hallways. They checked her phone screen more often than she wanted to admit, scanning for a blocked number, for a text from an unknown sender, for the particular shape of his silence pressing in around her. Gideon Cross was her ex-husband, former corrections officer. 6'2" and built like he'd been assembled for the specific purpose of filling a room and making people smaller inside it. He had never hit her with a closed fist until the 3rd year of their marriage, which was something she used to say to herself as a kind of sick reassurance, as if the first 2 years of shoves and slammed doors and nights. She spent sleeping with her back against the bedroom wall. Didn't count because there were no visible marks. The restraining order had been in place for 14 months. She had moved twice, changed her last name back, changed her route to work 4 times. She still felt him watching her sometimes, the way you feel a room change temperature before you see the cause. 47 stars. 48. She was taping the 51st when the lights in the hallway went dark. The school operated on a timer system after hours. Hallway lights cut out at 9:30. She knew that. She had known it for 2 school years. But the darkness that swelled up against the frosted glass panel of her classroom door still dropped her stomach 2 inches, still made her breath change quality, shallower, faster, quieter. She stood motionless beside the window ledge with a paper star in one hand and scissors in the other, and she listened to the building settle and creak around her, and she told herself she was being irrational, and her hands did not believe her. She packed up at 9:47, shoved her tote bag over one shoulder, turned off the classroom lights, checked her phone, low battery, 62%, she'd forgotten to charge it again. The hallway was all shadow and emergency lighting, green exit signs glowing at each stairwell. Her boot heels were too loud. She'd always meant to buy quieter shoes for evenings like this, but she never did because buying quieter shoes meant accepting that evenings like this were a permanent condition, and she wasn't ready to accept that. The parking lot was reached through the side exit by the gymnasium. She pushed through the heavy door and stepped into the rain, and the cold hit her face like an open hand. The lot was nearly empty. 3 vehicles. Her own car, a gray Honda with a cracked side mirror she kept meaning to replace, parked under the far lamp on the east end. A colleague's Subaru near the main entrance, which meant Sandra was still somewhere inside grading papers. And a black SUV she didn't recognize, idling without its headlights on beneath a flickering overhead lamp at the center of the lot. She saw it and stopped walking. The lamp above the SUV buzzed and stuttered, throwing light in irregular pulses that made the whole scene look like something from an old film reel. The vehicle's engine was running. She could see the exhaust lifting in pale curls into the rain. No movement inside that she could see from here. Just the rain and the engine and the broken light overhead, and her standing on the wet concrete 10 feet from the exit door that had already swung shut behind her with a heavy metallic click. She had left her key fob in her bag. She started to reach for it. The hand came around her throat from behind. Not from the SUV. From the narrow gap between the exterior wall and the gymnasium's drainage overhang, where a person could stand completely concealed in the dark if they had been waiting and patient and they knew her schedule. The grip was practiced, two-handed, the thumb driving up under her jaw. She couldn't scream. The pressure was too precise for that. He'd done this before, or he'd thought about doing this so many times it had become muscle memory. Her bag dropped. Her scissors were still inside the building. She was dragged backward. Her heels scraped against the concrete, and her hands clawed at the forearm across her throat, and she got one elbow free and drove it backward into his ribs. But the angle was wrong, and he absorbed it without releasing the grip. The rain was in her eyes. She could smell him, a particular chemical sharpness, like industrial cleaning solution mixed with sweat. And she knew. Before she even heard his voice, she already knew. "Stop fighting," Gideon said into her ear. "You're already done." The SUV's rear hatch opened from inside. One of his men, she hadn't seen the second person, hadn't thought to look, leaned out and grabbed her legs. She was horizontal before she understood what was happening, and then the trunk lid came down, and the darkness was absolute. She heard the locks engage, felt the vehicle rock as the doors closed. Then the engine surged, and the tires spat wet asphalt, and they were moving. Delaney lay on her side in the dark with her cheek against carpeted metal flooring that smelled of motor oil and something dried and old. She didn't let herself identify. Her throat ached. The blood on her finger had soaked through the tape. She put her hands flat on the floor and breathed through her nose, and told herself that the first thing she needed was to not panic, and the second thing she needed was her phone, and her phone was in her bag, and her bag was back in the parking lot of Ashcroft Elementary in the rain. Then she heard a clatter near her hip and realized her phone had fallen from her jacket pocket when they grabbed her. It had been in her jacket pocket, not her bag. She'd checked it at the door, 62% battery. That was the last time she'd had it. She found it by feel. The screen had cracked, a spiderweb fracture across the upper left quadrant, but the backlight still worked when she pressed the side button. 58%. She had 58% battery, and a cracked screen, and a moving vehicle, and Gideon Cross somewhere above her. She tried to open her contacts. Her hands were shaking badly enough that she kept hitting the wrong things, kept triggering the swipe function, kept dismissing the screen before it could load. She breathed, deliberately, counted to 3 on the inhale. She pressed the phone icon. Her contact list wouldn't load properly. The crack intersected with the upper portion of the alphabet display, and when she tapped the entries, nothing happened. She tried scrolling. Her hands weren't working the way hands were supposed to work. The car hit a curve, and she rolled against the side wall and lost the phone for 2 seconds and found it again with her other hand. Gideon was talking to someone in the front seat. She could hear his voice through the partition, flat and hard, the way he used to talk when he'd made up his mind about something and was explaining why he'd made that decision to someone whose opinion he didn't value. She couldn't make out the words, only the tone. And the tone was enough. That particular flatness in his voice had always meant the conversation was over before it started. She couldn't reach 911. Every time she tried to navigate to the dialer, the crack in the screen swallowed her input. She tried typing emergency and the keyboard froze. She tried Siri and the microphone activation did nothing. She went through her recent calls instead because the recent calls list loaded as a simple vertical scroll, and even with shaking hands and a fractured screen, she could manage a vertical scroll. The list populated in reverse order. Her sister's number from 3 days ago, a dentist confirmation. Sandra from school. A parent callback from 2 weeks back, a name she half recognized. She'd been returning calls from parent registration forms all month, working through the list alphabetically, and she remembered this particular entry because the contact had never answered, and she'd left a voicemail, and she'd wondered briefly what the parent's first name meant because it wasn't a name she'd encountered before. The name on the screen was R. Virelli. Emergency contact. She had no idea who he was. She remembered filling in the field from the paper form, remembered the handwriting was precise and the number was local, remembered nothing else. It was an emergency contact field. This was an emergency. She pressed call. It rang once. Who is this? Not a question. A demand, 2 words, no inflection. The voice was low and unhurried, the kind of voice that assumed it would be heard and did not waste energy on performance. There was background noise, the muffled sounds of other people moving, low music, something that might have been a restaurant or a private office or something else entirely. Delaney's throat hurt when she breathed. When she tried to speak, it came out fractured and wet. She pressed her hand over her mouth for a second and steadied herself. I've been taken. I'm in a car. He put me in the... I can't get out. A pause. 1 second. Maybe less. What's your name? Still no inflection, still that same flatness, but something had shifted underneath it, some quality of attention that was different from a moment before. Delaney Vale. I'm a teacher at Ashcroft Elementary. I called from your daughter's... My niece, he corrected her without emotion. She's my niece. Your niece. I'm sorry. I didn't know who else to call. I couldn't get 911 to... Where are you now? It wasn't a question about her emotional state. It was a request for operational information, and that precision cut through her panic better than any reassurance could have. In a trunk. A black SUV. We left the school lot maybe, I don't know, 5 minutes ago, maybe 7. We're on a highway. I can feel the speed. West or north, I think we went left out of the lot, which would be, don't guess, tell me what you can hear. She made herself listen. The road is smooth, no intersections recently. Rain on the roof. There's a sound like a bridge overpass. The acoustic change when we go under something. It happened twice. Is there more than one person in the vehicle beside the driver? I think 2 in front, maybe 2. I heard 2 doors close. Another pause. She could hear something shifting in the background, and then the ambient sound changed quality. The restaurant noise or office noise cut out, replaced by something quieter, more enclosed, like he had stepped into a different room. Don't hang up, he said. I'm going to put you on hold for 30 seconds. Don't hang up. Please don't. 30 seconds. And then the line went quiet without music, just the faint digital hiss of an open connection. She counted. She got to 24 before he was back. I have the vehicle's location. You've been on the line long enough for signal triangulation. I have people moving now. Who are you? Delaney said. She hadn't meant to ask it yet. She had meant to wait, to be strategic, to not ask questions that might complicate whatever help this person was offering. But the question came out anyway, because she was in a trunk with a cracked phone and bruises forming on her throat, and she needed to know whose voice she was trusting with her life. Someone who answers the phone, he said. It's enough for right now. She heard Gideon's voice spike from the front of the vehicle. Something had shifted in his tone. Less flat now, more agitated, the way he got when a plan was encountering friction. She pressed herself lower against the floor instinctively. He's angry about something, she whispered. Something's changed up front. He just found out his usual route is blocked. Construction closure on the I-78 connector. He'll take the Callaway overpass instead. A brief pause. I know this city. Tell me the moment the vehicle slows significantly. How do you know his route? Because I have people who know things. That's all you need to know. She heard duct tape being pulled from a roll somewhere in the trunk compartment. A metallic screech that made her stomach drop. Gideon or one of his men must have put it back there in advance. Preparation. He had planned this. He hadn't snapped and followed her to the school in a moment of rage. He had parked the SUV, waited in the rain against the gymnasium wall, had a man ready in the vehicle, had supplies in the trunk. The distinction meant something terrible about how this evening was supposed to end. He brought tape, she said. Her voice came out very small. I heard. Roman's voice remained level. Don't let him secure your hands if you can avoid it. Do you understand me? Fight that specifically. Your hands are more important to you right now than anything else. Okay. Say it back. My hands. I keep my hands free. Good. The vehicle slowed. She felt the deceleration, then a turn, then a different texture of road beneath the tires, rougher, older, less maintained. "We've slowed down," she said. "You're off the highway now. There's maybe 14 minutes of driving left. After that, the road dead ends." He said nothing else for a moment, and she understood what a dead-end road in the middle of a rainstorm at 10 o'clock at night meant, and she also understood that he understood it, and for some reason his clear-eyed comprehension of that fact was less terrifying than ignorance would have been. The trunk compartment opened without warning. Gideon Cross stood in the rain with a flashlight in one hand and the roll of duct tape in the other. He looked exactly as she remembered him. Wide shoulders, deep-set eyes, the jaw that never fully relaxed. Except there was something wrong in his face tonight, something that had come loose behind the eyes. He looked at her the way he used to look at things he'd already decided belonged to him. "You called someone," he said. Not angry, curious almost. She realized the phone screen was still lit beside her. She'd set it face down when the compartment opened, but she hadn't killed the call. Gideon reached past her and picked up the phone. He looked at the screen, read the name. His expression didn't change for a long moment. Then something moved through it. Not fear, not exactly, but the particular recalibration of someone who has encountered a complication they hadn't built into their plan. "R. Varelli," he read aloud. He looked at her. "You know who this is?" She said nothing. Gideon held the phone to his ear. "I don't know who you are," he said into the line. "But if you're planning something stupid, understand she dies first. I've got nothing left to lose." Whatever came back through the phone, Delaney couldn't hear it. She watched Gideon's face. He listened for about 5 seconds. Then he ended the call and dropped the phone into the mud beside the rear tire and brought his boot heel down on it. "Move," he said to Delaney. "Now!" She climbed out into the rain because there was no other choice. The duct tape came around her wrists while she was still trying to get her bearings. The flashlight in her eyes, the mud sucking at her boots, the trees enormous and black in every direction. They were far from any road she recognized, far from any light source except the SUV's headlights cutting yellow through the rain. Ahead, through the tree line, she could see the outline of a building. Large, dark. The skeletal silhouette of industrial machinery on the roof. Gideon's second man, heavy-set, cropped hair, saying nothing, fell into step on her right side. She had no phone. No way to know if Roman Varelli had heard enough. No way to know if anyone was coming or if she had placed her trust, in the worst moment of her life, in a stranger's voice and a signal that might have died the moment the phone hit the mud. Gideon's hand closed around her upper arm, and he steered her toward the building in the rain, and somewhere in the dark above the storm, she thought she heard, faintly, possibly imagined, the low growl of engines on the distant road. She made herself keep walking. She made herself keep breathing. Because breathing was the only thing she could control now, and she had been told by a voice she didn't know and somehow trusted completely that her hands were more important than anything else, and her hands were still moving inside the tape, testing the tension, finding the weak point in the bind, refusing to be still. She found the edge of the tape and dug her thumbnail beneath it. The building loomed ahead. Behind her, from somewhere impossibly far down the dead-end road, the sound of engines was no longer something she might have imagined. The building was a lumber mill that had stopped being a lumber mill sometime in the previous decade and had since become something else. A place where the machinery rusted and the roof leaked and the floor accumulated the particular grime of prolonged abandonment, that gray-brown sediment of decay that coats everything eventually when human attention withdraws. The exterior walls were corrugated steel, buckled in places from weather and age, and the rain hammered against them now with a sound like 1,000 small hammers working in unison. Delaney could hear it getting louder as Gideon's hand pushed her through the side door, could feel the change in air quality, from outside cold to inside cold, the second kind being worse somehow, being the cold of enclosed spaces where nothing lived anymore. Her eyes adjusted slowly. Emergency lighting ran along the baseboards, battery-powered strips that threw pale orange light across the lower 4 feet of the space and left everything above in shadow. The ceiling was high and mostly dark, the catwalks visible only as geometric shapes against slightly less dark sky visible through gaps in the roof. Water came through those gaps in thin, persistent streams, collecting in pools on the concrete floor that reflected the orange light in rippling ellipses. The main floor was roughly the size of 2 basketball courts. Industrial equipment occupied the center and left side. A decommissioned band saw the size of a small car, conveyor framework, sorting tables with the sorting mechanisms stripped out. On the right side, near a loading dock whose doors were rusted permanently half open, 4 men stood around a folding table with a battery lantern on it, and the light from the lantern hit their faces from below and made their expressions unreadable. Delaney counted them automatically. 4, plus Gideon, plus the heavy-set man on her right, whose grip on her arm had not loosened since they entered. 6 people total, not counting herself, in a building with one entrance she'd seen and possibly others she hadn't. The man standing at the head of the folding table was built narrow, older than the others, with gray at his temples and the unhurried posture of someone accustomed to having the most authority in whatever room he occupied. He wore a dark jacket that was too clean for this environment. He watched Gideon walk Delaney across the floor with an expression of mild professional evaluation, the way a purchasing agent might assess a delivery. "Gideon." His voice carried easily over the sound of rain on steel. No greeting, just the name, establishing position. "Granger." Gideon's hand tightened on Delaney's arm. He stopped 10 feet from the table. "I brought her, like we discussed." Silas Granger looked at Delaney with the same mild evaluation. She made herself meet his gaze, made herself breathe steadily, made herself not show him whatever he was looking for. Under the duct tape, her right thumb continued working at the interior edge of the bind, slow and methodical, the way you work a knot when your hands are numb and you can't see what you're doing. "She's marked up," Granger said. "She fought." "I can see that." He looked at the bruising along her throat, the cut on her temple from where the SUV's interior corner had caught her. "We need her lucid, Gideon. I told you that specifically." "She's lucid. She looks like she's been worked over." "She fought," Gideon said again, as if repetition was an argument. Something moved across Granger's face, not anger, closer to the expression of someone who has hired a contractor and is watching that contractor make a predictable and avoidable mistake. He reached into his jacket and removed a folded document. He set it on the table without looking at it. "Miss Vale," he said. "Do you know why you're here?" She said nothing. "You were at the corner of Meridian and 5th on October 19th, the afternoon of. Does that date mean anything to you?" She thought back, involuntarily. October 19th had been a Thursday. She'd stayed late that Thursday, too, then stopped for groceries at the corner market on Meridian because the one closer to her apartment was being renovated. She'd stood outside for a few minutes because the first drops of rain had started, and she was deciding whether to wait it out under the awning. She said nothing. "There were 2 men on that corner conducting a financial transaction," Granger continued, in the tone of someone reading from a prepared statement. "You were standing approximately 15 feet away for approximately 4 minutes. You had a direct line of sight. I was buying groceries. You were watching. I was waiting for the rain to stop." Granger studied her. "The man conducting that transaction is someone we need to have a conversation with. He's become difficult to locate. We have reason to believe you saw his face clearly enough to provide a description that could assist certain parties in locating him." He paused. "If you cooperate, this becomes a business matter. You provide information, you're returned to your life. And if I don't?" Granger didn't answer that directly. He looked at Gideon instead, and the look was the kind of look that carries information between 2 people who have already discussed what the answer to that question is. Delaney's thumb found the edge of the tape and peeled it back a millimeter. 2 millimeters. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said. "I don't remember anyone on that corner. I was looking at the sky." "That's disappointing," Granger said without particular emotion. "It's the truth. People often confuse the two." He picked up the folded document from the table. "I'm going to show you a photograph. I want you to tell me, this isn't what we agreed to." Gideon's voice was flat and sharp at the same time, like a blade that hasn't been properly finished. He hadn't moved, but something had shifted in the quality of his stillness. "We agreed to money. You get her, you do what you need to do, I get paid, and I'm out." "You'll be paid." "I'll be paid now." Gideon's grip on Delaney's arm hadn't changed, but she could feel the tension transmitting through it differently, could feel the specific muscular quality that meant his attention was no longer on her. Before I hand her over, that was the deal. Granger turned to look at him with the slow patience of someone trying to decide how much of their time this is worth. The exchange happens after I confirm the asset is viable. That's how this works. If she can't identify the target, the asset value changes. The asset value. Gideon's voice dropped. She's not an asset. She is currently a business transaction, Gideon. We can have a philosophical conversation about it at another time. Granger set the photograph on the table. Bring her closer. Neither of them moved. The four men along the wall had shifted positions subtly, not obviously. Just the small adjustments of people whose professional role requires awareness of escalation, and who have identified a potential point of friction and are quietly repositioning relative to it. Delaney was watching all of it. She was watching and breathing and working the tape and cataloging exit points and angles, and she was also watching the side entrance door she'd come through because it was the only door she'd seen, and she was thinking about the sound she may or may not have heard on the road before they entered the building, and she was deciding whether that sound was real or whether she had manufactured it from desperation, the way a person dying of thirst starts seeing water in flat concrete. Gideon, Granger said, bring her here or we renegotiate the terms of your compensation downward. You don't get to renegotiate. We had a deal in writing. Verbal agreements under duress aren't binding. Granger's voice hadn't changed temperature at all. And your current disposition suggests some duress was involved in our initial conversation. Bring her to the table. Something cracked open in Gideon Cross's face. It wasn't visible the way a dam crack is visible. It was more like a hairline fracture in load-bearing material. The kind that's been there long enough that the structural failure isn't a surprise to anyone who'd been paying attention. He'd been building to something for 2 years, maybe longer. The divorce, the restraining order, the suspension from the correctional facility that had followed the domestic assault documentation, the slow implosion of the identity he'd constructed around being a man with authority over things and people. He'd been building to something, and he'd built a specific story around it, a specific narrative in which tonight ended a particular way with him holding particular things, and Silas Granger and the Marrow Syndicate were supposed to be a vehicle for that ending, not a complication inside it. You don't tell me what she's worth, Gideon said. I'm not discussing this further. Granger turned away from him and spoke to one of the men along the wall. Bring her. The man pushed off from the wall and started across the floor. Gideon let go of Delaney's arm. She felt it happen, the sudden absence of his grip, and she understood without processing it consciously that this was not the relief it appeared to be, that Gideon releasing her was not Gideon relinquishing her. It was something else, something that came before something worse. She took one step sideways, instinctive, and her boot caught the edge of a floor pool and she went down to one knee in 4 inches of cold water. The man from the wall reached her first. His hand closed around her upper arm from the opposite side from Gideon had been holding. She felt the difference immediately. Gideon's grip had been personal, possessive, the particular pressure of ownership. This man's grip was professional and indifferent, the grip of someone performing a task. She heard the gun come out before she heard the shot. The sound in the enclosed steel building was enormous, a physical compression of air that hit the chest before the ears processed it as sound. The man from the wall yanked her sideways and she went down fully, both knees on concrete, head down, and then there was a second shot and a third, and the battery lantern on the table exploded and the room dropped into orange baseline light and screaming. Gideon had fired into the group at the table. She couldn't see who he'd hit. She couldn't see Granger. She was on the floor with her cheek against concrete and her wrist still bound, and somewhere in the chaos above her people were running and shouting, and she heard the sound of a heavy piece of equipment overturning. A man ran past her so close his boot heel came down 2 inches from her fingers. The rain hammered the roof. An exit sign near the loading dock cast a green smear across the smoke that was already beginning to accumulate from somewhere. The lantern, or something Gideon had hit, some chemical or fabric that had caught. She got her feet under her and pushed herself upright. Her hands were still bound. She found a support pillar 8 feet away and put her back against it and looked at the room. 3 of Granger's men were behind the overturned conveyor framework to her left, 2 of them with weapons out. The fourth man was down and not moving. Granger himself had disappeared, either down or behind something or through a door she hadn't seen. Gideon was behind the bandsaw housing, reloading, his movements fast and certain, the institutional training surfacing through whatever had broken open inside him. He was in his element in a way that made her stomach turn, the specific comfort of a man whose most functional self emerged in situations of immediate violent consequence. She looked at her wrists. The tape had maybe another minute of work in it before it would give. She pressed the bind against the corner edge of the support pillar, the rough metal, and began dragging it back and forth. A round punched through the pillar 2 feet above her head, and she dropped and kept dragging. The steel edge bit into the tape and into the skin of her wrist beneath it, and she didn't stop. Blood was warm on her thumb. She kept dragging. The tape parted. She got her hands apart and crouched low and moved along the wall toward the loading dock, toward the exit sign, toward the half-open doors that might lead to outside or might lead to nothing at all. A bullet clipped the wall 3 feet ahead of her, and she reversed direction without standing, went right instead of left, found the base of the sorting table, and used it for cover. A man she didn't recognize came through the side entrance door at a run. Then another. Then a third. And the third one had a weapon drawn and wore dark clothing and moved differently from Granger's men, moved with a particular contained economy, the kind that comes from having done this professionally and often. He went directly for the position of the 2 men behind the conveyor framework and took them both down in the time it takes to breathe out twice. The first man through the door had gone left toward the bandsaw housing. She heard Gideon shout something. The side entrance door opened again, and this time it stayed open. And the man who walked through it walked slowly, which was the wrong speed for everything else happening in the room. And that wrongness drew the eye, the way motion in peripheral vision draws the eye. Except this was stillness in a room full of motion. He was tall enough that he had to duck the door frame slightly. Dark jacket, no tie, the kind of face that had been rearranged by experience and had settled into something that communicated precisely what it needed to without effort. He looked across the room with the systematic attention of someone doing a fast threat assessment, and his eyes found Delaney behind the sorting table in the first pass, and he held that gaze for exactly 2 seconds, and she understood in those 2 seconds that he was the voice from the phone, that this was Roman Varelli, and that the way he looked at her was not the way someone looks at an asset or a victim or a complication. He looked at her the way you look at something you came here specifically for. She stood up from behind the table. There was blood on her face from the temple cut and blood on her wrists from the tape removal, and her clothes were soaked from the parking lot and from the trunk and from the floor pools, and she was shaking, a full-body tremor she couldn't control, but she stood up, and she looked back at him, and she did not look away. Across the room, Gideon Cross emerged from behind the bandsaw housing with his weapon up. Roman hadn't looked away from Delaney yet, but he said, to the room generally, without raising his voice, "Gideon Cross, put it down." "You've got about 4 guys left in here," Gideon said. His voice had a quality she'd heard before, rare but recognizable. The particular calm that came over him when the situation had simplified past the point of decision, when there was only forward, and he had already decided forward. "Mine are outside." "Your 2 men outside are sitting on the ground," Roman said. "They're alive. I made that choice. Generous. It was practical. I don't know them. I don't have anything against them. I have something against the situation." The situation. Gideon's weapon was pointed at Roman's chest. Roman's hands were at his sides, unhurried, which was either supreme confidence or a performance of it, and from where Delaney was standing she couldn't tell which and suspected it didn't matter. "You drove out here in the rain to fix a situation." "I drove out here for her." No qualifier, no apology for the directness. Something went across Gideon's face. "You don't know her." "I know enough." "You answered a phone call. That's all you know." "That's right." Roman took 1 step to the left, casual, almost conversational. "A phone call from a woman in the trunk of your car. That's all I know about her, and I drove out here in the rain." "Then you're an idiot." "Possibly." Another step left. "But I'm an idiot standing upright on this side of the room, and you've been in 3 firefights in the last 40 years of your life, not counting whatever happened before you joined corrections, and your hands are shaking. I can see it from here, Gideon. Your hands are shaking." "They're not." "They are. Left more than right. That's dominant hand fatigue. You've been running on adrenaline since the parking lot, and it's bleeding off." Roman stopped moving. You planned all of this. The parking lot timing, the backup vehicle, the deal with Granger. You planned it for weeks and now you're in a room where half the original plan is dead or gone, and the piece of it that was never about the plan, the piece that was about her, that piece is still running your body and your hands are shaking. The space between them had no sound in it for a moment except rain. Don't, Gideon said. His voice had changed. The calm was still there, but something underneath it had developed a crack. Don't tell me about her. I'm not telling you about her. I'm telling you about your hands. She left. Gideon said it quietly. She took everything and she left, and she got the law to erase me from my own house, and then she left because you made leaving the only safe option available to her. Roman's voice didn't change. Flat, factual, no editorial. That's not a romantic tragedy, Gideon. That's a sequence of choices. I made choices. Gideon's gun hand steadied. So did she. She chose to survive you. Yeah, she did. A pause. Put down the weapon. Gideon looked at Delaney. He looked at her for a long moment with an expression she recognized. Not the violence, not the anger. The thing underneath both of those that had been underneath them from the beginning. The hollow center of his need that had never been about love, despite all the language of love he'd applied to it. He looked at her, and she looked back, and she didn't give him what he was looking for because she had stopped having it to give 2 years ago. Come with me, he said to her, quietly, as if Roman wasn't there, as if the 3 surviving Marrow men weren't somewhere in the shadows, as if the building wasn't shot through and burning in 2 corners. Come with me right now and I'll... No, Delaney said. Just the one word. Gideon's face changed. Then Silas Granger came up from the dark behind the loading dock doors with a weapon in each hand, blood on his collar from a graze wound, and he pointed both at Roman and said, Nobody is going anywhere. And the room reconfigured itself around this new geometry, and Delaney felt the specific despair of a situation that has found a new way to be worse. Granger's 2 remaining men emerged from the shadows near the catwalks. Roman's 3 men shifted position. Gideon was still pointing at Roman. Roman's hands were still at his sides. 5 weapons in the air. The lantern was gone and the fire in the far corner was growing now, slow and orange, beginning to push real light into the room. I want the woman, Granger said. His voice had lost its professional evenness. Something underneath it had come forward. Older, uglier, the infrastructure of a man who had gotten to where he was by outlasting chaos. She knows a face I can't afford loose in this city. Everything else in this room is negotiable. She is not. She doesn't know anything, Roman said. She was standing on a corner waiting out rain. Whatever your man was doing there, she didn't see it. I'll determine that. She's a 3rd-grade teacher. Roman said it with the kind of patience that lives on the other side of contempt. She was buying groceries. Whatever your intelligence told you about a witness, the intelligence was wrong. My intelligence is never wrong. Your intelligence sent you to a lumber mill to buy a kidnapping victim from a domestic abuser. Recalibrate. Granger's expression shifted. He looked at Roman the way people look at something that has just revealed itself to be more complicated than they'd budgeted for. He looked at him the way people look at Roman Varelli when they finally understand who Roman Varelli is. You're Varelli, he said. Not a question. I am. The room absorbed this. Even Gideon's weapon lowered 2 inches. This woman is nothing to you, Granger said carefully. That's been established. Roman's voice was even. She called a number she found on a registration form. That's the whole story. And I came out here. Why? Because I came out here. He didn't expand on it. Here's what happens now, Granger. You walk out of this building. Your men walk out. You take your surviving operational personnel and you leave the county tonight. What you lose in this room, you consider the cost of a bad intelligence assessment and you absorb it. And if I don't... Roman looked at him, just looked. The fire in the corner was bigger now. The smoke was low and beginning to drift across the floor. The orange light caught the surfaces of everything. The rusted machinery, the hanging catwalks, the standing water, the faces of the men in the room. Gideon Cross raised his weapon again. Not at Roman, at Delaney. "Nobody leaves," Gideon said, "until I'm done." Everything that had been accumulating since the parking lot, the rage, the grief, the obsession, the planning, the execution of the plan, the failure of the plan, the arrival of the one outcome he had not planned for, which was someone coming for her, someone taking her side, someone standing in this room because of her. All of it had burned down to this single point. His hands weren't shaking anymore. "Gideon," Roman started. "Don't." The weapon tracked to Delaney's chest, steady now, both hands. "If she leaves with you, if she leaves here and goes somewhere I can't find her and disappears into whatever protection you're offering her, if that happens, then everything I did tonight was for nothing, and I am not going to be nothing." Delaney looked at the gun. She had been afraid of Gideon Cross for 2 years in a way that lived in her hands, in her sleep, in the quality of her attention to every hallway she walked down. She had organized her life around his possible presence the way buildings are organized around the possibility of earthquakes. Not expecting it constantly, but never fully not expecting it. Looking at the barrel of the gun, she discovered something. She wasn't afraid of him anymore. She was afraid of the gun. She was afraid of the specific mechanical fact of it. But Gideon himself, the thing he represented, the power he had held over her body and her daily existence for years, that particular fear had gone somewhere she couldn't locate. Maybe it had burned off in the trunk of the SUV. Maybe it had been replaced by something more immediate and more survivable. She looked past the gun at Gideon's face. "You won't," she said. His eyes moved. "If you pull that trigger, you lose the only thing you came here for. You came here for me to know that you still have this, that you still have the ability to—" She stopped, steadied herself. "You don't want to shoot me, Gideon. You want me to be afraid of you, and I'm not. So you've already lost what you came here for." Something moved through his face that she had never seen on it before. Not rage, not obsession. Something that looked terribly like grief. His weapon arm flexed, and from the catwalks above, one of Roman's men who had moved silently through the darkness during the long conversation dropped a support cable housing onto the electrical conduit running along the east wall, and the section of emergency lighting above Gideon's position died, and the room reconfigured in darkness and firelight, and Delaney dove left as 2 shots split the air above where she'd been standing. The room came apart. Granger fired. Roman's men returned fire from 3 angles. Gideon was moving through the dark by instinct, using the machine housings as cover, firing toward the last position he'd marked for Roman. The smoke was thicker now. Someone was shouting in a language she didn't recognize. The fire had reached the sorting table she'd been hiding behind. Roman materialized beside her in the dark. His hand closed around her arm, different from Gideon's grip, different from the Marrow Man's grip, different in a way she could identify but not describe in the moment. "Move," he said. "Stay low. There's a door in the north wall behind the bandsaw housing. My people have it clear." Granger, handled. He was already moving, keeping himself between her and the direction of the gunfire, angled in a way that wasn't protective performance, just geometry, just the body positioning of a man who has calculated this kind of trajectory before. "Can you run?" "Yes." "Then run." She ran. Behind her, in the burning mill, she heard Gideon Cross scream her name, not in rage anymore, or not only in rage, in something rawer, more animal, the sound of a man who has arrived at the end of a long road and found the destination empty. She didn't stop. She didn't look back. Ahead, the north door was open, and Roman's man was holding it, and cold rain hit her face like a second chance, and somewhere in the tree line were vehicles and people who had come out here in the dark and the storm because a voice had said, "Come." And she ran toward the rain and the dark and the sound of engines, and she did not look back at the fire or the name or the grief that would never belong to her. She cleared the door, and inside the mill, in the orange smoke and firelight, Silas Granger found a secondary exit and took it, bleeding, already calculating, already calling someone she and Roman didn't know about yet. Someone higher in the Marrow Syndicate structure, someone with authority over outcomes that hadn't yet been decided. Someone who would hear the name Roman Virelli and not feel relief that the situation had been contained. Someone who would feel something else entirely. The rain had not let up. It came down through the tree line in long diagonal sheets, and the vehicles Roman's men had staged along the logging road sat with their engines running and their headlights off, and the only light came from the burning mill behind them, orange and growing, pressing through the trees in pulses that made the shadows move in ways shadows shouldn't move. Delaney was in the back seat of the second vehicle with a wool blanket someone had pressed into her hands without explanation and a bottle of water she hadn't opened yet. Her wrists had been wrapped with a field dressing by a man who hadn't introduced himself and hadn't spoken while he worked, and had moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had dressed wounds in worse conditions than the back seat of an SUV in a rainstorm. She watched the mill through the rain-streaked window. The north wall had begun to go. She could see it in the way the fire changed color at the base of the structure, the particular blue-orange shift that meant the steel was heating past its tolerance, that the internal framework was starting to surrender. Someone was still moving in the trees between the mill and the road. Roman's men clearing the perimeter, she gathered, working systematically through the darkness in pairs. Their communication reduced to hand signals she couldn't read from where she sat. Roman was outside the vehicle, 20 feet ahead, standing at the hood of the lead SUV with two of his men. She could see his outline through the windshield glass in the rain. He was looking at a phone, and the quality of his attention had shifted from the focused physicality of the mill to something more cerebral, more deliberate. He was reading something. His posture didn't change, but the man standing to his left noticed whatever was on that screen and said something, and Roman looked up from the phone and looked toward the tree line and said something back, and the man to his left walked quickly to the third vehicle and got in. Delaney opened the back door. "Ma'am?" The man in the front passenger seat turned. "I need air," she said. "I'm not going anywhere." He looked at her for a moment, then faced forward again. She stepped out into the rain with the blanket still around her shoulders, and it immediately started absorbing water and growing heavy, and she didn't care. The cold was clean in a way the inside of the vehicle was not. She breathed it in and stood in it and let it work on her. Roman turned when he heard the door. He looked at her across the 20 feet of wet road, and she looked back at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment. His face in the firelight from the burning mill was difficult to read. The high planes of it caught the orange light, and the rest fell into shadow, and she was aware that she was trying to apply normal evaluative frameworks to a person who did not operate inside the conditions those frameworks were designed for. He walked toward her. "You should stay in the vehicle," he said. "I know." He stopped beside her. He didn't look at the mill. He looked at her face, at the dried blood on her temple, at the field dressing on her wrists. His expression was the same controlled flatness as the phone call, but she was close enough now to see that underneath it something was running faster than the exterior suggested. Something with a higher metabolic rate than calm. "Granger got out," he said. "I heard shots after we cleared the door." He had a secondary exit, east side. "We found the door, but not him." He paused. "My people are running a cordon, but in this weather, on foot through the trees, he's gone. For tonight, yes." She processed this. "He's going to come back. Not him specifically. He's operational. He executes other people's decisions. The person he reports to. That person will respond to tonight." Roman's jaw worked once. We knew that as a possibility going in. It changes the immediate calculus. She looked at him. "What does that mean for me?" "It means you can't go back to your apartment tonight, or possibly for several nights." He said it plainly, no softening, no apology for the plainness. "I have a secured location. You'd have staff there, your own space, full communication access. It's not a cage, but you'd need to stay there until I understand the scope of what Granger's organization knows about you. And if I say no, then I take you somewhere else. A hotel, a family member's place, wherever you choose. And I put two of my people outside it regardless." He looked at her steadily. "You don't have to accept anything from me, Delaney. I'll keep you safe either way." The use of her first name was the first unguarded thing he'd done since the mill. She didn't think he noticed he'd done it. She pulled the wet blanket tighter. "Okay. Okay to the secured location? Okay to trusting your judgment about what tonight changed. You know this world. I don't." She held his gaze. "But I want information. Everything you find out about why Granger's people thought I was a witness, I want to know it." A pause. "Agreed." He turned back toward the lead vehicle, and she fell into step beside him because standing in the rain alone served no further purpose. And as she walked, she looked back once at the mill, at the north wall fully involved now, at the fire eating through 2 years of abandonment and rot and whatever else those walls had contained before tonight. And she thought about Gideon, whether he was in there, whether he'd gotten out, whether the distinction mattered, and discovered she couldn't locate a clean emotion about it, only a complicated sediment of years that she was too exhausted to sort through. She got back in the vehicle. They left the logging road at 11:47. The secured location was 40 minutes north of the city in a residential zone that had been built in the 90s and had the particular aesthetic of that era. Large houses on generous lots, mature trees, the kind of street where nobody looked out their windows at midnight because they'd paid for the privacy not to have to. The house Roman used was 3 stories, unremarkable from outside, and had been retrofitted in ways that weren't visible from the street. She didn't ask about the retrofitting. She was shown to a room on the second floor by a woman named Petra, who had a Slovenian accent and the unhurried competence of someone who managed complicated situations for a living. Petra provided dry clothes in Delaney's approximate size, a first aid kit with topical anesthetic, and 3 sentences of orientation: bathroom, emergency call button, breakfast at 7 if she wanted it, and then left her alone. Delaney sat on the bed in dry clothes and didn't sleep. She went through the events of the evening in order, methodically, the way she processed her students' behavioral incidents after school, not to assign blame, but to understand the sequence, to find the points where intervention was possible and the points where it wasn't. It was a clinical habit, useful and slightly broken in equal measure. She got to the moment in the mill when she'd told Gideon she wasn't afraid of him, and she sat with that for a while, examining whether it had been true or whether she had said it strategically, and she concluded it had been both, which was a more complicated category than she was used to operating in. At some point before 4 in the morning, she lay down. She didn't close her eyes for a long time. When she did, she slept without dreaming, which was the first time that had happened in longer than she could precisely remember. She was awake again at 6:43. She found Roman in a ground-floor room that served as a working office. 2 monitors, a phone system, a whiteboard with names and numbers written in a hand she recognized as precise from the registration form. He was on the phone when she appeared in the doorway, and he held up one finger without looking up, finished the call in 30 seconds, and set the phone face down on the desk. He looked like he hadn't slept at all. She didn't mention it. Gideon got out, he said. He's in a county medical facility. Smoke inhalation and a through-and-through on his left arm, non-critical. Police are with him. Whatever story he tells them will be interesting. A pause. He'll protect himself by staying vague. He doesn't want to be connected to the Marrow Syndicate any more than they want to be connected to him. So he's alive. He's alive. Roman watched her face. Does that change anything for you? She thought about it honestly. No, I don't want him dead. I want him in a courtroom. She paused. I want it to be legal. I want documentation and a judge and all of it. I know that's... It's not naive, he said. It's what it is. We'll get there. She believed him when he said it, which was a strange thing to believe from a man she'd met 6 hours ago through a cracked phone screen in the trunk of a car. But the strangeness of it didn't make it less true. What about Granger? She said. Roman turned to the whiteboard. He picked up a marker and tapped it once against a name in the upper right quadrant. Not Granger's name, a name above it, connected by a line. Granger reports to a man named Everett Dole. Dole runs the Marrow Syndicate's northern operations. Legitimate businesses on the surface. Logistics, import warehousing, a private security contractor. He paused. Last night, I assumed Granger was acting with Dole's authorization when he contracted Gideon. Standard operational protocol. But he wasn't. Roman set the marker down. My people ran communications intercepts through the night. Granger ran this operation unilaterally. He didn't tell Dole he was moving on a witness. He didn't tell Dole he was making a deal with Gideon Cross. He certainly didn't tell Dole that he was going to put a kidnapped elementary school teacher in front of 5 weapons in a lumber mill, while Everett Dole's name was somewhere in the jurisdictional vicinity. Delaney was quiet for a moment. Which means Dole is furious and scared, Because what happened last night created exposure for his organization that he did not authorize and cannot fully contain. Roman's voice remained level, but she could hear something underneath it. Not anger, something more structural than anger. The tectonic movement of a long-game assessment being updated. Dole reached out to me this morning. She stared at him. He reached out to you. At 5:20, through an intermediary, he wanted to open a dialogue. About what? About making last night disappear. About establishing that neither party has interest in escalation. Roman's eyes moved to the whiteboard. Dole and I have a history of parallel operations. We stay out of each other's lanes. It's been functional for 3 years. He was calling to reestablish that boundary and to signal that Granger acted without sanction and will be, I'm quoting the intermediary here, addressed internally. That means Granger is going to be killed. Probably. She absorbed this. And you? What did you say to Dole's intermediary? I said I'd think about it. He turned from the whiteboard, which is when I found out about the other thing. Something in his voice had changed. Not the temperature of it, that stayed flat, but the weight. Like a door that's been normal all your life has just revealed a room behind it you didn't know existed. What other thing? She said. Roman reached past the phone and picked up a single printed page from the desk. He looked at it for a moment before he handed it to her, and the look was not hesitation, she understood later, it was preparation. The specific expression of someone who has processed bad information and is now deciding how to present it to someone who hasn't processed it yet. She took the page. It was a communications intercept, formatted in columns, timestamp, sender identifier, recipient identifier, message content. The messages were brief, operational, stripped of everything except transaction. She read the first 3 and understood the format. She read the next 2 and understood what she was looking at. She read the name in the recipient identifier column and went very still. The name was Marcus Webb. She knew Marcus Webb. She had known him for 11 months. Marcus Webb was the Blackwater Ridge Police Department's lead detective on domestic violence and stalking cases. He was the detective who had processed her restraining order against Gideon Cross. He was the detective who had called her 3 times in the past year to confirm the order was current, to ask if she had seen any sign of Gideon's presence near her home or workplace, to assure her that the department was monitoring Gideon's activity and that she was safe. He was the person she had trusted most in the institutional apparatus of her own protection. The communications were between Granger and Webb. They spanned 9 weeks. The content was specific, operational, and unambiguous. Webb had been feeding Gideon Cross's movements to Granger's organization for 2 years. Not directly, not in ways that connected him to Gideon specifically, but in ways that served Granger's operational interest in keeping a particular corrections officer unstable, leverageable, and angry. More than that, Webb had been the one to flag Delaney's presence on Meridian and 5th to the Marrow organization. He had run her as a potential witness and passed that assessment to Granger without verification, without actually establishing whether she'd seen anything actionable, because passing her name up the chain had value to him, regardless of her actual culpability. He had lit the fuse. Gideon would have found her eventually. She had understood that at some cellular level since the divorce, understood it the way you understand a storm forming offshore, the question being not whether, but when. But the specific timing of last night, the specific configuration of it, the particular combination of Gideon's obsession and Granger's operational interest and the lumber mill and everything that had followed, that configuration had a human architect, and his name was Marcus Webb, and he had her phone number in his contacts and had used it to call her 3 times in 11 months with a voice she had trusted. She set the page down on the desk. She set it down carefully, which was the only externally visible indication of what was happening inside her, because her hands had gone completely still, and the stillness had nothing instinctive in it this time. It was entirely deliberate. It was the stillness of someone standing over a long fall and making a conscious choice not to move too fast. "How long have you had this?" she said. "Since 4:45 this morning." "You didn't wake me. There was nothing actionable at 4:45. I needed to verify." "Is it verified?" "Yes." She looked at the whiteboard, at the names, the lines between them, the organizational geography of something that had been running beneath the surface of her understood world for years without her being able to see it. She thought about all the times she had called Marcus Webb's direct line, all the times she had believed his voice when it told her the system was working, all the carefully documented evidence she had submitted, all the court filings, all the restraining order renewals that she had trusted to a process whose integrity she had never had cause to question because she had never had evidence to question it with. The violation was not primarily emotional. That would come later. She understood that the emotional processing of this was on its way and would be substantial and would require more time and resource than she had right now. What it was primarily was structural. It was the discovery that the architecture she had built her safety on had a load-bearing wall that was rotten, had been rotten from early in the construction, and everything she had placed on top of it in the intervening years had been resting on that rot. Webb doesn't know about last night yet, Roman said. Not the full picture. He'll know about the mill from police scanners. He may know about Gideon's hospitalization. He doesn't know about this intercept, and he doesn't know how much we know. What do you do with this? What do you want to do with it? She looked at him. He was watching her with the same quality of attention as the parking lot the night before, the quality she had identified as seeing rather than observing, and she thought about his niece, about the registration form, about whoever had answered when his mother made a call and whatever that meant, about the architecture he'd built his own life on. I want it in front of a federal prosecutor, she said. Not Blackwater Ridge PD, not the state, federal. I want Webb removed from every file with my name in it, and I want every case he touched reviewed, and I want it done through channels that can't be dismantled because someone made a phone call to Everett Dole at 5:20 in the morning. Roman nodded once. I have a contact at the federal level. He's clean. I've used him before for different reasons and in different directions, but he's clean. He paused. Using him means disclosing some of my own operational history to establish the intercept's credibility. That's a trade I'm willing to make. You'd expose yourself. Selectively. His mouth did something that was not quite a smile. I've been doing this long enough to know which parts of the iceberg can surface without sinking the ship. She breathed in once through her nose. Out. She looked at the single printed page on the desk and the 11 months of trust it had just retroactively voided. There's something else, Roman said. Of course there was. He picked up his phone and turned it to face her. A photograph. Surveillance quality, taken at distance, slightly grainy from the zoom. A man she didn't recognize, heavy set, leaving what appeared to be a parking structure. The timestamp in the lower right was from last night, 40 minutes after the mill. This is Dole's intermediary, Roman said. The man he sent to contact me this morning. He let her look at the photograph. My people ran him. He's not a Marrow Syndicate operative. She looked at him. He's BCPD, Blackwater Ridge Criminal Intelligence Division. Roman's voice remained level. Which means when Dole made contact with me at 5:20 this morning to open a dialogue about making last night disappear, he did it through a police department asset. She understood what this meant before he finished saying it. Webb isn't the only one, she said. Webb isn't the only one. She stood in the office of a man she'd known for less than 12 hours, in dry clothes that weren't hers, in a house she couldn't have found on a map, and she held the weight of this new information and what it implied. Not just about last night, not just about Gideon and the mill and the 14 months of a restraining order that may have been functionally meaningless from the start, but about the scope of what she was standing in the middle of, and how much larger it was than a kidnapping, than an obsessive ex-husband, than one detective on a payroll. She had walked into a school parking lot in the rain to go home. She was now somewhere inside a network of institutional corruption that had been operating for years and had her name in its files and a police contact managing its external communications, and a man at the top of it who had called Roman Varelli at 5 in the morning to ask politely for a ceasefire. I need you to be straight with me, she said. I have been. Straighter. If this goes federal, if we take the Webb intercept and the Dole connection to your federal contact, what happens to the people above Dole? Because there are people above Dole. There are always people above the person you can see. She looked at him steadily, and if any of those people have a reason to want this buried, a real reason, a career-ending or freedom-ending reason, then taking this to a prosecutor doesn't make me safer. It makes me a target of a completely different size. The silence that followed was not comfortable. But it was honest, which was something. Roman set his phone down. He put both hands flat on the desk and looked at the whiteboard, and she could see him actually thinking, not performing thought, but doing it, working through the real topology of what she'd just described. Yes, he said finally. There are people above Dole. I know one name with certainty, and I suspect two more. If those names are connected to what happened last night, and if they believe a school teacher and a communications intercept and a federal referral represent meaningful exposure, he stopped. Started again. Yes, the size of the target changes. How much? Enough that you can't go back to Ashcroft Elementary until this is finished. Enough that finished means finished, not paused. He looked at her. I won't tell you it's simple. It isn't. But I've been building a case against the upper structure of this organization for 18 months, for reasons that have nothing to do with last night. And what you're holding on that page accelerates everything I've been working toward by considerably. He paused. What I'm asking you to consider is not whether you want to walk into a dangerous situation. You're already in one. What I'm asking you to consider is whether you want to walk through it towards something that ends it, or try to step out of it and spend the next several years waiting to see if it follows you. Delaney looked at the printed page, at Marcus Webb's name in the recipient column, at the timestamp of the first message, which was dated 11 days after she'd filed her original restraining order, which meant that within 11 days of her entering the formal protection system of Blackwater Ridge, a detective in that system had been passing information about her case to an organized crime intermediary. 11 days. She thought about her hands going still at headlights. She thought about the 4 route changes to work. She thought about the apartments, the name change, the locked bathroom door, all of it. The entire infrastructure of a life organized around surviving a single dangerous man. And she understood that the infrastructure had never been as solid as she'd built it to feel, had been penetrated from early on, and that the 2 years of careful survival she was most proud of had been navigated inside a system that was partly designed to fail her. She picked up the printed page. Who do I need to talk to? She said. And what do I need to say? Roman straightened. Something moved across his face that she cataloged and set aside for later consideration. Something that was not quite relief and not quite respect, and sat in a complicated intersection between them. He reached past the whiteboard and opened a drawer and removed a second file. It was thicker than she expected. 18 months, he said, setting it on the desk in front of her. Start from the beginning. Tell me everything you remember about October 19th on that corner, every face you saw, every vehicle, every exchange, even things you dismissed as irrelevant at the time. Because I think you saw more than you know, and I think what you saw is exactly why Granger flagged you, and I think what you saw is going to matter in a federal courtroom in ways neither of us can fully map yet. She opened the file, and in the margin of the first page, in small, precise handwriting that matched the registration form, was a name she hadn't seen before, a name that appeared 4 times in the first 2 pages, and that she recognized on the third appearance as belonging to a state legislator whose photograph she had seen on a campaign billboard on the Callaway Overpass, the same overpass Gideon had detoured around the night before, the same overpass she had passed under in the dark, in a trunk with a cracked phone pressed against her palm. She looked up at Roman. His expression confirmed what her face had asked. The file got heavier in her hands. Outside, the rain had finally stopped, and the morning light coming through the office window was pale and new, and gave nothing away about what the day intended. And somewhere across the city, Marcus Webb was sitting at his desk at Blackwater Ridge PD, drinking a cup of coffee and reading the overnight incident reports, and finding the lumber mill fire, and Gideon Cross's hospital admission, and making a phone call to a number that was not in his official contacts, not knowing yet that the intercept of the call he was about to make would be the third piece of evidence in a federal file that was already open, already building, and already had his name at the top of the first. The federal contact's name was Harlan Briggs, and he drove himself to the house in a 10-year-old Volvo with a cracked dashboard and a U.S. Attorney's Office parking pass hanging from the rearview mirror, and he came alone, which Roman had required, and he arrived at 9:47 in the morning, looking like a man who had been awake since the phone rang at 7 and had not stopped moving since. He was mid-50s, gray at the temples, with the particular physical quality of someone who had once been athletic and had redirected that energy entirely inward. Not soft, but compressed, like a spring that had been under load for a long time. He sat across from Delaney at the kitchen table, and he looked at the printed intercept, and he looked at the file Roman had opened, and he did not say anything for 4 minutes. She counted. She was good at counting things when she needed something to do with her attention. "How did you get this?" Briggs said finally. To Roman, not to her. "Operational capacity," Roman said. "That's not an answer I can use in a courtroom." "It's the answer you have right now. The answer you can use in a courtroom comes after you open a formal inquiry and subpoena the communications through legitimate channels, which the intercept tells you exactly where to look." Roman sat with his arms on the table, relaxed in the way of someone who has had this kind of conversation before and knows which parts of it are productive. "You don't need my methodology. You need the destination." Briggs looked at him for a long moment. "You understand what you're asking me to do. I'm asking you to do your job. I'm asking you to understand the scope of what this touches. If the name on page 4 of that file is connected to this operation in the way your intercept implies..." Briggs stopped, pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of his nose. "This isn't a Marrow Syndicate case anymore. This is something that goes into categories of investigation that have their own protocols, their own oversight, their own political gravity." "I know what it is," Roman said. "I've been building toward it for 18 months. Briggs looked at him differently then. "How much of this did you have before last night?" "Enough to know the shape, not enough to move on." Roman's eyes went briefly to Delaney. "She gave me the piece that closes the circuit." Briggs looked at Delaney. "What did you see on October 19th? She had spent the hour before his arrival going through it with Roman, reconstructing the corner of Meridian and 5th in the specific detail of recent memory accessed cold. Not the impressionistic summary she would have given if asked, but the granular sequence. She gave Briggs the same reconstruction now. The time of arrival, the awning she'd stood under, the 2 men at the southeast corner, the vehicle parked at the curb. She described it, make and color, and a partial plate she'd registered without knowing she was registering it. The exchange, which she had processed as a handoff of some kind and dismissed as none of her business. The face of the man who had received the handoff, which she could describe in sufficient detail that Briggs stopped her twice to ask her to slow down. When she finished, the kitchen was quiet. "You have a good memory," Briggs said. "I teach 8-year-olds. You develop a memory for what people do when they think no one's watching." Briggs looked at the file. He looked at Roman. He put his palms flat on the table and made a decision that she could see him making, could see the specific weight of it passing through him. "I need 48 hours to open the inquiry through proper channels," he said. 48 hours before I can put any of this in front of a judge. During those 48 hours, nothing in this room can move. Nothing leaks. No one makes contact with Webb or anyone connected to this network." He looked at Roman specifically. "I mean that. Whatever operational response you were considering, I understand," Roman said. "Do you?" "I said I understand." Briggs gathered the file and the intercept with the care of someone handling something that has weight beyond its physical mass. He put them in a plain leather portfolio and stood. "I'll need a formal statement from Miss Vale within the 48 hours. Recorded, witnessed, protected, under federal shelter." He looked at her. "Until the inquiry is formally opened, you're safest exactly where you are." He left. The house was quiet. Roman stood at the window and watched the Volvo back down the driveway, and Delaney stayed at the kitchen table, and they held the 48 hours in the air between them like a thing with uncertain structural integrity. "Do you trust him?" she said. "As much as I trust anyone in that category." "That's not a yes." "No," he said. "It isn't." He turned from the window. "But it's the best option that exists within the constraints you set, legal, documented through legitimate channels. This is what that looks like in practice. It involves trusting Harlan Briggs and his 48-hour timeline." She nodded. She understood. She didn't love it, but she understood that not loving it was not a relevant consideration. What happened next happened because someone talked. Not Briggs. She learned that later when the forensics of the leak were reconstructed, and the source turned out to be a paralegal 3 offices removed from Briggs at the U.S. Attorney's Office, who had a gambling debt and a contact in the Marrow Syndicate's financial network, and who had overheard enough of a phone call at 11 in the morning to put together the shape of what was coming and pass it up a chain that reached Everett Dole's office by 1:15 in the afternoon. The first indication was Roman's phone. He picked it up, read something, and his posture changed in a way that was not dramatic and was therefore more alarming than if he'd reacted dramatically. He read it twice. He put the phone in his pocket, and he looked at her with the expression of a man recalibrating under load. "Dole knows about Briggs," he said. The temperature of the room changed. "How?" "That's secondary." He was already moving to the door of the office, into the hallway, calling out to Petra in a tone that carried information by its quality alone. "What matters is that the 48 hours are gone. Whatever Dole does in response to knowing a federal inquiry is opening, he does it now. Today? Not in 2 days. What does he do? He moves to eliminate the exposure." Roman came back into the kitchen and looked at her with a directness she had come to recognize as his version of gentleness. Not softened, just unobstructed. "You're the exposure, Delaney. Your statement, your testimony, your memory of October 19th. Without that, the intercept is supporting material. With it, it's the foundation." She understood what he was saying. She had understood it before he finished saying it. "So they're coming here. They're coming somewhere. They don't know this location yet." He paused. "But Dole has resources I'd rather not underestimate." What followed was 30 minutes of controlled preparation that Delaney watched from the periphery of, because the preparation was in Roman's operational language, and she did not speak that language, and inserting herself into the logistics would have slowed everything without adding value. Petra moved through the house with a kit bag. 2 of Roman's men who had been on the perimeter came inside. The vehicles were repositioned. Roman made 3 calls, each under 90 seconds, each in the clipped register of someone transmitting operational coordinates. He came to her when it was done. "There's a secondary location," he said. 40 minutes from here. Smaller, less infrastructure, but cleaner sightlines and only one access road. I want to move you there." "Okay. We leave in 5 minutes." "Roman," she stopped him. "Is this going to work? The Briggs route, even with the timeline compressed, even with Dole moving, is this something that can actually be finished? Or are we managing it indefinitely?" He looked at her for a long moment. "If we get your statement recorded and into federal custody in the next 6 hours, yes, it finishes." He said it with the particular certainty of someone who has thought past the obstacles to the outcome. The statement plus the intercept plus the name on page 4. That combination, in federal hands, creates a weight of exposure that even Dole can't absorb. The calculus changes. People above Dole start calculating their own exposure. The organization starts contracting to protect its core. You stop being a target worth the cost. 6 hours. 6 hours. She picked up the jacket Petra had left on the chair back. They didn't make it to the secondary location. The vehicles were 2 minutes down the residential street when Roman's lead car braked hard, and Roman's driver reacted without being told, cutting right into a side street, and Delaney was thrown against the door and caught herself on the handle and looked through the windshield and saw what had made the lead car stop. 2 vehicles, blocking the end of the street, not police vehicles, dark SUVs with their engines running, positioned at an angle that closed the road in both directions. "Out," Roman said. Already moving, already at her door. She was out before the vehicle fully stopped, the pavement jarring through her knees, Roman's hand on her arm running, not dragging. There was a difference and he understood it, cutting through a gap between houses toward a rear alley, while behind her she heard doors opening and voices shouting and the specific flat crack of a suppressed weapon that didn't sound like the movies, sounded smaller and worse. The alley was narrow and smelled of old garbage and wet concrete, and her boots hit puddles she didn't see coming, and the cold water soaked through her socks, and she ran. Roman was beside her. Not ahead of her pulling her, beside her, matching her pace, which told her something about how he'd calculated this, about the balance he was maintaining between speed and keeping her in his peripheral line. Behind them, in the gap between the houses, she heard 2 more shots, then nothing for 4 seconds, then running footsteps that were closer than she wanted them to be. The alley opened onto a commercial block, a dry cleaner, a hardware store, a Vietnamese restaurant with its chairs stacked in the window. It was midday, and there were people on the street, Ordinary midday people with bags and coffee cups and phones, and running out of an alley with blood beginning to seep through the field. Dressing on her wrist, and a man beside her with the specific body language of someone in active threat response was going to create a situation that complicated everything. Roman slowed to a fast walk immediately. She matched him. "Don't look back," he said quietly. "Hardware store. Now." She walked into the hardware store behind him, and he was already speaking to the man behind the counter before she got through the door, low and fast, and she didn't hear what he said, but the man behind the counter nodded once and lifted a section of the counter, and they went through it into the back. The back of the hardware store was storage and a delivery entrance and a bathroom and a small office with a monitor showing 4 security camera feeds. Roman sat her in the office chair and crouched in front of her. He was breathing hard. Not the breathing of someone out of shape, the breathing of someone who has been running on managed adrenaline for over 12 hours and is now drawing on reserves. "Are you hurt?" he said. "No, you." He checked himself the way you check yourself when you've been moving too fast to notice damage. A quick internal inventory, hands checking sides, back of the head. "Fine." He straightened. He got his phone out. "Briggs, I need to..." His phone buzzed before he could dial. He looked at the screen. Something shifted behind his eyes. "What?" she said. He turned the screen to show her. A text message, no sender name, just a number. The message was 4 words and a photograph. The 4 words were, "We have the girl." The photograph was of Roman's niece. She was in what appeared to be a school environment. The background was a corridor, lockers visible, institutional lighting. She was looking at the camera with the particular expression of a child who has been told to look at the camera by an adult she doesn't know and is trying to decide whether to comply. The specific suspended uncertainty of a 7-year-old encountering something wrong that she doesn't have the vocabulary for yet. Delaney stopped breathing for a moment. Roman's face did something she had not seen it do before. Not the controlled flatness, not the deliberate calm. Something came through it that was older and more fundamental than professional composure, the expression of a person encountering the specific threat that lives below all the other threats, the one that doesn't respond to calculation. He called a number. It rang once. "She was picked up 40 minutes ago," a man's voice said from the phone. Older, unhurried, the voice of someone conducting a transaction. Everett Dole spoke the way his intermediary had moved, with the patience of someone accustomed to having the most leverage in the conversation. "She's unharmed. She'll remain unharmed. These are the terms. The Veil woman is delivered to a location I'll specify within 3 hours. The federal contact is stood down. The materials from last night are surrendered. When these conditions are met, your niece goes home." Roman said nothing. "You have people looking for her right now," Dole said. "Call them off. Every hour you spend looking is an hour she spends uncomfortable. I'm not interested in harming a child, Varelli. I'm interested in closing a file. Make the choice." The line went dead. Roman lowered the phone. Delaney looked at him. She watched the architecture of his face rebuild itself from the inside out. Watched the thing that had broken through get put back under load-bearing control. Watched him become again what he'd been in the mill and the parking lot and the office. The man who moved through chaos with terrifying precision. But she could see the seam now. She could see where the control was covering something that had no controlled expression. "How old is she?" Delaney said. 7. "What's her name?" A pause. "Sophia." Delaney stood up from the chair. Where would they take her? What location makes operational sense for Dole? Somewhere controllable, accessible, that his people know. Roman looked at her. "Think," she said. "Because we have 3 hours, and whatever you're about to tell me about surrendering me to that location, don't. Tell me where Sophia is instead." "Delaney, she is 7 years old and she was in a school corridor and someone pointed a camera at her." Her voice was steady in a way that cost something. She could feel what it cost, could feel the specific expenditure of reserve. "Tell me where she is." He told her. The Dole organization used a warehouse facility in the Port District. Legitimate import operation on the surface. 3 stories. Private security contractor on site. The same security contractor that appeared in Roman's 18-month file as a Marrow syndicate front. It was 12 minutes from their current position if they moved now. It had 2 primary access points and 1 secondary that Roman knew from prior surveillance and that Dole's people may or may not have accounted for. Dole expects you to spend the first hour trying to find her through normal channels, Delaney said. He expects you to spend the second hour calculating whether to comply. He doesn't expect you to move on the location directly because he doesn't think you know it. I know it, Roman said. Then we have the 3 hours inverted. She looked at him steadily. And we have something else. Briggs has the intercept. He has the file. Even if we never make it to the secondary location to record my formal statement, even if everything goes wrong in the next 3 hours, the material is already in federal hands. Dole doesn't know that yet. He thinks the leverage is complete because he has Sophia. He doesn't know the file is already partially in motion. Roman was very still, which means, she said, that the 3 hours aren't actually about me. They're about him thinking they are. She watched him process this, watched him move it through whatever framework he used to evaluate tactical reality, the same framework that had placed him beside her rather than ahead of her in the alley, that had calculated pace and angle and proximity with the part of his mind that never fully went off duty. There are 4 people in that facility, he said. Minimum. Possibly 6. With a child present. I know. If it goes wrong, I know. She picked up the jacket again. Call your people. Tell them the secondary location, not the port facility. Let Dole's surveillance pick that up. Give him the version of events he's expecting. While we go to the port. While we go to the port. He looked at her for a long moment with the expression she had first catalogued in the burning mill and had not yet found adequate language for. You're a 3rd-grade teacher, he said. I am, she said, and Sophia is in my class. The silence lasted exactly 1 second. Then Roman moved. He made 2 calls in the back of the hardware store, each 30 seconds, each surgically specific. He spoke to Petra. He spoke to someone whose name she didn't catch. He checked his weapon. She watched him do it, the practiced check of someone who has done it so many times it has become metabolic, magazine, chamber, safety, and the weapon disappeared back into the holster with the same economy. And then he looked at her. Stay on my left, he said. Whatever happens in there, stay on my left. If I say down, you go down immediately. No evaluation, no hesitation. If I say run, you run for the secondary access point on the north side of the building and you don't stop regardless of what you hear behind you. Okay. Say it back. Left. Down means down. Run means the north access point. And you don't stop. I don't stop. He held her gaze. Sophia does finger paintings on Fridays, Delaney said. She does them on the window with the suction cup easel. She always uses too much blue. Something moved through Roman Varelli's face that was not professionalism and was not calculation. He opened the delivery entrance door. The port district was gray and salt-smelling, the air carrying the specific cold of proximity to open water, and the warehouse sat between 2 larger structures on a service road that saw legitimate truck traffic during business hours and had gone quiet now in the midday lull. They came in from the north along the water-facing side of the building, moving fast along the wall, and she could feel her heartbeat in her wrists and her throat and the soles of her feet on the wet asphalt, that full-body pulse of a system running above its normal operating parameters. Roman stopped at the secondary access point, a loading bay door padlocked, the hasp showing the particular shine of a lock that had been replaced recently. He studied it for 4 seconds. He produced something from inside his jacket that was not a key and worked the lock with the focus of someone performing a precise physical task that requires speed and cannot be rushed. And it opened in 11 seconds and she was counting because counting was still the thing her mind did when it needed an anchor. The interior was cold and high-ceilinged, stacked with legitimate inventory, import goods in sealed pallets, labeled in 3 languages. The light was industrial, overhead fluorescence on a sensor system that activated in sections as they moved through. Roman killed the sensors for their section from a panel near the door with a precision that told her he had been in this building before, had mapped it in advance, had prepared for exactly this contingency or one close enough to it that the preparation transferred. They moved through 2 sections of inventory without encountering anyone. In the 3rd section, a man stepped around a pallet corner with a radio in his hand and no weapon drawn, because he was security personnel on a routine walk, and his threat assessment had not yet updated to include the possibility of Roman Varelli entering through the north access point. He started to raise the radio. Roman was already inside his reach. The radio hit the floor without transmitting. The man went down against the pallet and stayed down, breathing, which she noted, still alive. Roman had made that choice again, the same choice as the two men outside Gideon's vehicle the night before, and she filed the pattern, voices above them. The building had a mezzanine level accessible by a steel staircase 20 feet ahead. The voices were male, two of them, and underneath them, not speaking, a smaller quality of sound that her teacher's ear identified before her conscious mind processed it. The particular quality of a child trying to be very quiet, because a child has understood that quiet is what the situation requires. Roman's hand touched her arm once. Stop. And he listened with his whole body for 8 seconds. Then he looked at her and held up 2 fingers. 2 people on the mezzanine. He pointed up, then pointed at himself, then held up 1 finger. He would take the staircase. 1 route. He pointed at her and pointed to the left, toward a secondary staircase she could now see at the far end of the building, a fire access stairwell with a push-bar door at the bottom. She understood. 2 points of entry. The mezzanine had 2 exits, the main staircase and the fire stair. And if she was at the fire stair when he came up the main, no one on that mezzanine could move without moving toward one of them. She was not trained for this. He knew she was not trained for this. He looked at her and she looked back at him, and she thought about Sophia's finger paintings and the too much blue, and she nodded once. She moved left. The fire stair door was heavy, and the push bar had a tendency to catch. She could feel it in the resistance, and she eased it open with both hands, managing the sound, letting in a crack of space and holding it, and through the crack she could see the mezzanine from the far end. A partial view. Enough to see 2 men, enough to see a folding chair near the center railing. Enough to see the small shape in the folding chair with her knees pulled to her chest and her face turned down and her dark hair falling forward in the particular way of a child who is making herself smaller to occupy less of a situation she cannot exit. Sophia. Delaney's chest did something violent and specific that she did not have time for. She pushed through the fire door and put her foot on the first stair, and at the same moment she heard Roman's footsteps hit the main staircase, and the 2 men on the mezzanine heard it too and turned toward the main stairs. And in the 2 seconds of their attention being oriented away from the fire stair end, she came up the last 3 steps onto the mezzanine and crossed the distance to the folding chair in a straight line that had no hesitation in it at all. Sophia looked up. The expression on her face, the specific movement from controlled fear to recognition to something that broke open like a window letting in air. Delaney had seen that expression before. Had seen it on the faces of children who had been holding something difficult for too long and had just been given permission to put it down. She got her arms around Sophia, and she turned so her back was between the child and the room. Behind her, the mezzanine became something very loud and very fast, and she stayed low, and she stayed down, and she held on, and she did not let go. Then there was a shot. Single, close, the concussive air of it pressing against her left ear, and then the particular quality of silence that follows a room after the last weapon fires. A silence that is not peace but is the absence of. Then Sophia made a sound against Delaney's shoulder. Not a cry. Not the release of accumulated fear. Something smaller and more fundamental than either of those. The sound of a child exhaling a breath she had been holding since a stranger pointed a camera at her in a school corridor, and her understanding of the world shifted into a register she had no framework for. Delaney kept her arms around her and kept her back to the room and listened to the mezzanine with the part of her attention she could redirect, cataloging the sounds. 2 bodies on the floor, 1 moving, 1 not, the scrape of a boot on steel grating, Roman's breathing, which was controlled but audible now in a way it hadn't been before. She turned. One of Dole's men was down against the railing and would not be getting up. The other was on his knees with his hands behind his head, and Roman's weapon pointed at the back of his skull, and Roman was looking at the kneeling man with the flatness she recognized, but there was something underneath it now that had not been there before, a tectonic pressure that the flatness was working harder to contain. He was bleeding. Left side, below the ribs. She could see the dark stain spreading through his jacket fabric, slow and definite. He hadn't mentioned it. He was still standing with his full weight on both feet, still holding the weapon steady, still managing the room with the economy of someone who has not yet allocated attention to his own damage because the room isn't finished yet. "Roman," she said. "Take her to the north access point," he said, not looking at her. "The way we came in. Wait at the door. You're bleeding." "I know, north access point." She looked at him for 2 seconds and understood that arguing would cost more than complying. She picked Sophia up. The child was heavier than she looked, had gone dense and boneless the way children do when they finally stop holding themselves together, full weight against Delaney's chest and arms locked around her neck. And she moved to the fire stair and went down. At the north access door, she stopped and held Sophia and listened to the building above her, and did not go through the door because the door led outside, and outside was unknown, and she had been told to wait at the door, not through it, and she was done making interpretive decisions about instructions she'd been given precisely. 4 minutes. Then Roman came down the fire stair. He had the kneeling man's zip ties around his own wrists. She understood that he'd restrained the surviving guard before leaving the mezzanine, that the 4 minutes had been operational closure, not hesitation. His left hand was pressed against his side. His face had gone a shade paler than it had been, and the controlled quality of his movement had tightened, that particular tightening of someone managing pain through concentration, allocating processing power to the override of physical signal. He looked at Sophia first. Some of the tightening eased. "Hey," he said to his niece, quietly. The word carried everything he didn't say. Sophia lifted her face from Delaney's shoulder and looked at him. Her expression did the thing that children's expressions do. Complex emotional information transmitted with total transparency, no protective layering, just the face showing everything. She was frightened, and she was relieved, and she was angry in the particular way of a child who has been scared and knows that being scared was wrong and wants the wrongness acknowledged. "You took too long," Sophia said. Roman's mouth moved, not quite a smile. The closest thing to one she had seen from him. "I know," he said. "I'm sorry." He pushed the north access door open, and they went out into the port air. Petra was outside with 2 vehicles, already running, already positioned, and she took Sophia from Delaney's arms without being asked and settled her into the back seat with the practiced efficiency of someone who had managed crises involving this particular child before. And Sophia let herself be settled, which was its own kind of trust. Roman got into the front of the second vehicle, and Delaney got in beside him because she was not willing to be in a separate vehicle from him right now, and if he had an objection, he didn't voice it. He called Briggs before the door fully closed. "The facility was used," he said when Briggs answered. "I need a federal team at the Port District warehouse on Callaway Pier within the hour. There's 1 secured individual on the mezzanine level and 1 who won't need processing. There's physical evidence throughout the structure that supports the file you're holding." A pause. "I also need medical." He said it the way he said everything, without inflection, as a logistical requirement rather than an admission of vulnerability. Briggs said something she couldn't hear. "The child is safe," Roman said. "Miss Vale is safe." He paused again. "Move fast, Harlan. Dole knows the timeline is compressed. He'll start destroying material within the next few hours." He ended the call. The vehicle was moving. She didn't know who was driving. She couldn't see past the headrest, and she didn't look. She was looking at Roman, at the way he held himself in the seat, the particular angle of his torso that minimized pressure on the left side, the way his right hand rested on his knee with the fingers slightly spread, the small physiological tells of someone in sustained pain running a functional override. "How bad?" she said. "Manageable." "That's not a number." "Through and through, no organ involvement." He looked straight ahead. "I've had worse." "That's also not a number." Something crossed his face that was too tired to be amusement and too genuine to be anything else. 2, maybe 3 stitches. "I'll live, Delaney." She looked at his profile for a moment. At the jaw that didn't fully relax, at the specific geometry of a face that had learned to give away only what it chose to give away. And she thought about the voice from the phone call, the voice that had said, "Don't hang up," with a quality of absolute steadiness that had been the only fixed point in a world that had just become entirely fluid. And she thought about the distance between that voice and this man, and found that the distance was smaller than she'd expected. Your mother, she said. He didn't react visibly. You said nobody answered when your mother made that call. She kept her voice level. Not clinical, just present. You don't have to tell me. A long pause. She called a neighbor, he said finally. There was a man in our house who should not have been in our house. She called the neighbor because she didn't trust the phone line, because he checked the phone line. The neighbor heard it and waited to see if it resolved itself. He looked at the road. It didn't resolve itself. She didn't say anything. I was 11, he said. I was in the apartment next door at a friend's and I heard it through the wall, and I didn't understand what I was hearing until it was already over. He paused. The neighbor waited 17 minutes before calling for help. 17 minutes is a very specific number when you're 11 years old and you spend time afterward trying to reconstruct it. I'm sorry, she said. It was 30 years ago. He said it the way people say things that are simultaneously true and insufficient as a summary. It was 30 years ago, and you still answered the phone, she said. He didn't respond to that immediately. The vehicle made a turn and the Port District fell away behind them, and the city came up around them. Ordinary midday city, traffic and storefronts, and people who had spent the last 18 hours doing ordinary things, entirely unaware of what had been happening in lumber mills and warehouses and the back rooms of hardware stores. I answer every call from that number, he said finally. Anytime someone uses that emergency contact field. Mia's school, her activities, the registration forms. He paused. I've gotten 3 calls in 4 years. 2 were administrative. One was a genuine emergency 3 years ago. A child had a medical episode during a field trip, and they called all emergency contacts on the list. He looked at the road. And then your call. What made mine different? You were in the trunk. You knew that immediately? I knew within 30 seconds. His hand on his knee moved, the fingers closing and opening once. The acoustic profile of a vehicle interior is specific. The way you were breathing, the way you couldn't complete sentences. He stopped. I've heard that quality of breathing before. She understood he meant his mother. She didn't say it. You came anyway, she said. I came because I was already in the car, he said. The decision was made before I had time to make it. That's the honest version. The vehicle stopped. They were outside a building she didn't recognize. Medical, from the architecture. A private facility with no external signage. A man in scrubs was already coming through the door, which told her Roman had made a call she hadn't heard, or Petra had managed the logistics from the parallel vehicle. Roman got out and he moved with the controlled deliberateness of someone whose window of functional override is narrowing, and she got out on her side and came around and walked beside him through the door. She stayed in the waiting room while they worked on him. Petra arrived 20 minutes later with Sophia, who had been given a granola bar and a bottle of water, and had conducted what appeared to be a full emotional processing cycle in the intervening time, and emerged from it with the resilience of someone who has not yet learned that resilience is supposed to be difficult. Sophia sat beside Delaney in the waiting room and ate the granola bar, and said nothing for a while. Then she said, "Are you okay?" Delaney looked at her. At the dark hair and the careful eyes, and the specific quality of attention that she recognized from Classroom Fridays, from the finger painting sessions where Sophia always chose the blue paint first and used too much of it and never seemed to notice or care. "Yeah," Delaney said. "I'm okay." "Your wrist has a bandage." "It does." "Does it hurt?" "A little." Sophia considered this. "Uncle Roman has a bandage too sometimes. He says it doesn't hurt, but his face does the thing." "What thing?" "The tight thing." Sophia demonstrated, pressing her lips together and lifting her chin slightly, and the resemblance was so precise that Delaney felt something move through her chest that was not grief and not quite laughter, but lived in the neighborhood of both. "I know the tight thing," Delaney said. Sophia nodded with the satisfaction of someone whose observation has been corroborated. She finished the granola bar and folded the wrapper into a small rectangle with the methodical focus of a child performing a task that exists primarily to fill time. And Delaney watched her hands and thought about the registration form and the emergency contact field and the particular randomness of how things connect. How a paper form typed on an October afternoon becomes the architecture of survival 4 months later. How the things that save you are almost never the things you constructed specifically to save you. how they are instead the side effects of ordinary care. Harlan Briggs arrived at the medical facility at 2:40 in the afternoon. He was not alone. There were two people with him she didn't recognize, and the quality of their presence, the particular federal quality of people who move with institutional authority in plain clothes, told her that the inquiry had moved faster than 48 hours, that the material had been enough to accelerate the timeline, that the compressed 3 hours had not in fact compressed everything. Briggs sat across from her in a side room with a recording device on the table between them, and he took her statement, all of it. October 19th on the corner of Meridian and 5th, the awning, the rain, the two men, the vehicle, and the partial plate, and the face she had seen clearly enough to describe in the detail he kept asking her to slow down for. She gave him the entire evening, the parking lot, the trunk, the phone call, the mill, the intercept, the file, the port facility, Sophia. She gave it to him in order and completely, holding nothing back, because there was nothing left to hold back, and because the only version of this that ended cleanly was the version in which a federal record contained every piece of it. Briggs stopped the recording at 4:17. The name on page 4 of the file, he said. He looked at her steadily. State Legislator Carver Payne. You understand what prosecuting this means in terms of public exposure. I understand. It will not be quiet. There will be coverage. Your name will be connected to a major criminal prosecution with a political dimension. He paused. I want to make sure you understand what you're walking into. She looked at him. Detective Marcus Webb sat in his office at Blackwater Ridge PD for 11 months and called me 3 times to tell me I was safe. He did that while passing information about my case to people whose interest was in keeping my ex-husband unstable enough to be leverageable. She held Briggs's gaze. Whatever I'm walking into, I've already been standing in it. I just didn't know. Briggs looked at her for a moment. Okay, he said. He closed the recording device. Webb was arrested at 6:15 that evening at his desk at BCPD, which was where Delaney had imagined him all day. Sitting there drinking coffee, reading incident reports, making calls on the number not in his official contacts, building the daily architecture of a double life that had become so habitual he had stopped treating it as exceptional. She wasn't present for the arrest. She learned about it from Briggs's assistant via a brief text message that read, Webb in custody. More to follow. The brevity of it was almost absurd given what it represented. 11 months of false safety collapsed into 11 words. But she had learned in the past 24 hours that the most significant things had the most inadequate containers. Everett Dole was taken at his home at 7 in the morning the following day by a federal team. She learned about this later, after it was over. Learned that he had been awake when they came, had been dressed and sitting in his living room, which the agents took as a sign that he had known it was coming and had made his peace with it, or the version of peace available to a man in his position. He did not resist. He asked to call his attorney and was permitted to do so. These details came to her secondhand, filtered through Briggs's updates, and she processed them with the particular numbness of someone who has spent their emotional reserves and is running on the secondary system. Carver Payne resigned from the state legislature on the 3rd day. He did not hold a press conference. He released a written statement through his attorney that contained no admission of wrongdoing and no explanation, and was notable primarily for its brevity, 11 sentences to close a political career that had run for 16 years. The statement made the front page. Delaney read it once and did not read it again. Gideon Cross was transferred from county medical to county detention on day 4, pending charges that had accrued faster than she had expected. The kidnapping, the assault, the weapons charges from the mill, and because of the Marrow Syndicate connection and Dole's cooperation agreement with the federal investigation, additional charges that reflected the full context of what October 19th and everything that followed had actually been. His attorney entered a not guilty plea at the arraignment. Delaney was not present. She had a representative from Briggs's office there instead, and she received a summary afterward in the same efficient, inadequate textual format as everything else. She went back to Ashcroft Elementary on the 9th day. Not to teach, not yet. The district had arranged a leave with full pay and no pressure on the timeline. Her principal had called twice to say the classroom was waiting whenever she was ready and had managed to communicate genuine care rather than institutional obligation in both calls, which she appreciated. She went back at 7 in the morning before anyone arrived because she wanted to be in the classroom alone before it became a place with people in it again. The paper stars were still there. Most of them. A few had lost their fishing line and come down onto the desks, and the ones that remained on the ceiling had shifted in the air currents of the intervening 9 days and redistributed themselves differently than she'd arranged them. New patterns, new constellations that had no names. The gold and silver foil still caught the early light when it came through the east windows and threw small bright shapes across the rows of empty desks, and she stood in the doorway and looked at it for a while. She went in and picked up the stars that had fallen and set them on her desk. She was sitting at her desk, not doing anything in particular, just being in the room, when she heard the car outside. She knew the sound of it by now. The particular engine note of the vehicle Roman used, the way it stopped slightly before it needed to, the driver anticipating the parking space by 2 seconds. She had learned these details over 9 days the way you learn the details of anything that becomes part of your daily context, accumulating without intention. She went to the window. Roman was outside in the gray of early morning, parked across the street, engine off. Alone, as far as she could see. No visible security, no second vehicle. He sat behind the wheel and looked at the school entrance where the flag was still, where the flagpole rope tapped the pole in the light wind, the small irregular percussion of it the only sound in the empty street. She went downstairs and outside. The air was cold. The kind of early October cold that had moved in while she wasn't paying attention to seasons, that arrived not as a dramatic shift but as a slow encroachment of something that would be here for a long time now. She crossed the empty street in her coat and her bag and her flat shoes that made noise on the pavement regardless. Roman got out of the car when he saw her coming. He moved without the controlled tightening of 9 days ago. The wound had been cleaned and closed and was healing at the pace such things heal, and the hold he'd been maintaining against the physical signal had eased back into the ordinary maintenance level that, she understood now, was probably his baseline. He wore a dark jacket and looked like himself, which was to say, he looked like someone she had known for 9 days and felt as though she had known for much longer, which was a phenomenon she had identified and not yet determined what to do with. He looked at her face, checking, the way he had checked every time he'd seen her in the past 9 days. Not conspicuously, not as surveillance, just the quick, unconscious accounting of someone who has been in a situation with another person and carries the residue of having been responsible for her in ways that don't fully dissolve when the situation ends. "Sophia's class starts at 8, he said. "I know. I'm her teacher. She made something for you." He reached into the car and brought out a piece of construction paper, folded in quarters. She took it and unfolded it. It was a finger painting, blue, predominantly, the excess blue that Sophia always used, spread in overlapping arcs across the paper with the flat palm technique of a child who has not yet learned to be economical with color. In the center, rendered in yellow over the blue, 2 figures standing next to each other in the approximate shape of people, the figurative shorthand of 7-year-old fine art. Beneath them, in careful block letters that showed the concentration of a child who knows handwriting is supposed to look a particular way and is trying, Miss Vale and Uncle Roman. The 2 figures in the painting were the same height. She looked at that for a moment. Then she looked at Roman. "I didn't instruct that detail," he said. "I know. She makes her own compositional decisions. She always has." Delaney folded the painting carefully on its original creases and held it. "How is she?" "Back to normal. Mostly." A pause. "She asked me last week if the bad men were going to come back, and I told her no, and she accepted that, and then 2 minutes later she asked me if I wanted to play cards, which I took as a good sign." "That's exactly how children process things," Delaney said. "They ask the big question, and then they need to move." "Yeah." He looked at the school entrance. "I didn't know that." "You do now." They stood in the early cold for a moment. Down the street a bus went by, the first of the morning, carrying its cargo of ordinary people to ordinary destinations, and the light was coming up now over the roofline of the school and making the street look the way streets look in early morning when the city hasn't fully committed yet to being the day's version of itself. The Payne investigation is going to take 18 months at minimum, Roman said. Briggs told me yesterday. The federal case is solid, but it's large. Webb has cooperated significantly to reduce his exposure, which means the documentation trail is comprehensive, which means the process is going to be long and visible, and you'll be a named party throughout. I know. If you need anything during that period, anything that falls outside what Briggs's office can provide, I know, she said again. He looked at her. I'm not going to pretend the world you operate in is something I can fully map, she said. I spent 9 days in your secured location, and I watched how things work in your context, and I'm not naive about what that context is. She held his gaze. But I also spent those 9 days watching how you make decisions. What you choose to do when the options available to you include things that most people wouldn't choose not to do. She paused. That tells me more than the context. He was quiet for a moment. That's a generous interpretation. It's an accurate one. She tucked Sophia's painting into her bag. You kept her alive. You kept me alive. You could have handed me to Dole and gotten Sophia back without the port facility, without the wound, without any of it. The math was there. The math was wrong. I know it was wrong. That's what I'm telling you. She looked at him steadily. You knew it was wrong before you could calculate why. Something moved through his face that was not the tectonic shift of someone managing concealed weight, but something closer to the surface, something that the controlled architecture of his expression had less capacity to contain than it had 9 days ago. Delaney, he said. You still never told me why you actually answered, she said. The real version, not the 30-second explanation. He looked at the school, at the flag and the flagpole rope tapping in the wind, at the entrance where in 40 minutes children would start arriving with their backpacks and their uncontained noise and their complete inability to be anything other than exactly what they were. I answered because nobody answered, he said. When my mother called, 30 years ago, nobody answered. He paused. That's not a complicated reason. No, she said. It isn't. It didn't feel like a decision. It felt like the only option available. Those are sometimes the same thing. He looked at her. The morning light was full now. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just the ordinary sufficiency of a clear October morning that had decided to be adequate rather than remarkable. And it hit his face at the angle that showed the seam she'd found in the mill, the place where the architecture thinned, and she looked at it and didn't look away. Sophia told me last Tuesday that you were the best teacher she'd ever had, he said. I asked her how many teachers she'd had. She said 3. I said that was a small sample size. He paused. She told me sample size doesn't matter when you're sure. Delaney smiled. It was the first smile that had used all the muscles it was supposed to use in 9 days. The real version, the one that had to be earned. She's 7, she said. She already knows that. Roman looked at the smile for a moment with the attentiveness he applied to things he was committing to memory. I should let you get to work, he said. You should. Neither of them moved immediately. The city was coming up around them fully now, the ambient sound building in layers. Traffic, a distant siren heading somewhere else, a dog barking 2 blocks over. The ordinary accumulating evidence of a morning that was deciding to be ordinary. Down the street, a car turned in the direction of the school, and she could see from its speed that it was a parent drop-off, arriving early, and behind it another. She picked up her bag. My number's the same, she said. The one you called from the registration form. I know. Not just for emergencies. He held her gaze for 2 seconds. Okay, he said. She crossed back across the street toward the school entrance, and she heard the car door close behind her, but she didn't hear the engine start for a long time after that, and she didn't look back. Not because she was afraid of what she'd see, but because she didn't need to. Because she knew he was there, and knowing was enough for the morning, and the morning was enough for right now, and right now was more than she'd had 9 days ago when she'd stood in a parking lot in the rain with no phone and no plan and nothing but the particular stubbornness of a person who was not finished yet. She pushed through the school entrance. The hallway smelled like industrial cleaner and old carpet, and the particular smell of a building that has been occupied by children for decades, that has absorbed their noise and their energy and their ordinary daily passage through it into its walls. And she walked down the hallway, and the paper stars in her classroom were waiting, and the empty desks were waiting, and in 35 minutes, Sophia Varelli would come through the door with her backpack and her considered opinions and her approach to blue paint, and Delaney Vale would be standing at the front of the room where she was supposed to be, where she had always been, where she intended to keep being. She unlocked her classroom door. She went inside. She turned on the lights, and the paper stars caught them, and the small bright shapes fell across the empty desks like something scattered by hand, and she stood in the middle of them for a moment before she sat down and got to work.